The courtroom fell silent, and the weight of justice seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Jamal Williams, a 27-year-old man with a family to support, sat nervously in the defendant's chair, his heart pounding. His fate rested in the hands of Judge Harold Granger, a man whose reputation was well known, not for fairness, but for his deep-seated biases. Today the evidence was clear. Jamal was innocent. Yet, as the judge glanced over the paperwork with a practiced disinterest, a cold sneer spread across his face. What was supposed to be a pivotal moment of justice turned into a chilling display of power. The courtroom doors closed behind Jamal, and he realized the fight for his freedom had just begun. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this one. The courtroom was a grand, imposing room with high ceilings that made everything feel just a little too small. The walls, adorned with dark oak paneling, seemed to echo with the whispers of past cases, some of them historic, others, like Jamal's, much less remembered. He tried to steady his nerves as his lawyer, a woman named Claire Hayes, whispered final reassurances. Her voice was calm, but the tension in her eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. In a city where justice had been historically uneven, Jamal's case was supposed to be a beacon of hope, a clear-cut instance of a man being wrongly accused and finally getting the chance to clear his name. Jamal had grown up in the shadows of this courtroom. His mother had always warned him to be careful, that the law wasn't always his friend, and that despite what everyone said about equality, the odds were stacked against him because of the color of his skin. He'd heard it before, but today, sitting in that cold chair under the harsh gaze of Judge Granger, it hit harder than ever. He was fortunate to find Judge Granger an exceptionally just man. Judge Harold Granger was notorious for his prejudices. His decisions had left a trail of injustice in their wake, but he was well regarded among the city's elite. To most, he was just another powerful figure, someone whose judgment seemed to be beyond question. His presence in the courtroom alone was enough to make the air thick with discomfort. The courtroom doors swung open and Judge Granger stepped in, his eyes scanning the room with a chilling calmness. As he took his seat, a murmur rippled through the spectators. This was it, the moment that would change everything for Jamal. Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his palms damp with sweat. He had never felt this vulnerable in his life. The evidence against him was undeniable. Surveillance footage, eyewitness testimonies, and even forensic reports all pointed to his innocence. Yet the moment the trial had begun, something about Judge Granger's demeanor had unsettled him. The judge's eyes never met his, always a glance of condescension or indifference, but never a real look of consideration. Claire Hayes stood confidently, presenting the case with poise. She spoke of Jamal's background, his clean record, and how he had been falsely accused of assaulting a local businessman. The evidence, she emphasized, was a clear contradiction to the charges. But with every word Claire spoke, Judge Granger seemed to grow more agitated, his pen tapping against the desk, as if marking time, counting down the minutes until he could rule. Jamal couldn't help but notice how Granger's eyes lingered on him, scrutinizing his every movement. He felt like an insect pinned under a magnifying glass. There was something unsettling in the way Granger seemed to take pleasure in the power he wielded, as if his every decision was a reminder of his superiority. As Claire finished her argument, the room fell into an uneasy silence. The judge didn't speak immediately. Instead, he flipped through the evidence with deliberate slowness, as if savoring the moment of control. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, cold. "The defense makes an excellent case," Granger began, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But sometimes we must look beyond the surface to see the truth. This trial has been a waste of time." He paused for a beat, eyes narrowing as he glanced at Jamal. "I've seen enough." Jamal's heart sank as Claire's face went pale. She had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier to process. The judge was about to do what he had done before, dismiss the evidence. It wasn't the first time a ruling had been skewed, but something about this felt different. This time, Jamal couldn't just walk away with his head down. He had to fight back. As the judge prepared to make his ruling, Jamal's thoughts raced. He could feel the eyes of the spectators on him, their silent judgment heavier than any words. They didn't know the truth, but Jamal wasn't sure if he could bear another defeat. He had worked so hard to get here, to prove his innocence, and yet it seemed like the system was against him. It wasn't just a matter of freedom, it was a matter of dignity. and right now it felt like that dignity was slipping through his fingers. The judge's voice broke the silence. "I find the defendant guilty based on the overwhelming circumstances. The evidence is—" He trailed off as he looked at the papers again, scanning them quickly, almost dismissively. "Dismissed." The room felt like it had been plunged into ice. Jamal's breath hitched in his chest. His mind raced. Was there no justice in this courtroom? But just as Jamal was about to lose hope, something unexpected happened. A faint sound, faint but growing louder, echoed in the hall. It was a shuffle, the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps. Then the sound of the courtroom doors slamming open. All eyes turned toward the entrance. The figure that stormed into the courtroom was none other than George Thompson, a renowned civil rights activist and former prosecutor. His presence was an immediate disruption to the tense, suffocating atmosphere that had settled over the room. George had been following Jamal's case closely, and though his involvement was not expected, he had made it his mission to expose the corruption that ran deep in the local justice system. Judge Granger froze, his hand hovering over the gavel, confusion flashing across his face for the first time. Claire's eyes widened in surprise, her jaw slack as she stood frozen beside Jamal. George, tall and imposing, strode forward with a sense of urgency, his every step echoing in the hushed room. He was flanked by a few other individuals, their expressions grave and determined. The judge's gaze hardened and he attempted to regain control. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" Granger demanded, his voice shaky yet authoritative. "Your Honor," George said, his voice firm and unwavering, "I've come to ensure that justice is truly served in this case. You see, there's something you've missed, something that goes beyond the evidence that you've dismissed." The room stirred with whispers, and Jamal felt his pulse quicken. Was this a trap? Was George truly on his side, or was this some kind of trick? But George's next words, spoken with quiet authority, made everything fall into place. "You see, Judge Granger," George continued, his eyes locking with the judge's, "we've been investigating your rulings for the past few years. Your track record with black defendants is a troubling one. But this," he held up a folder thick with documents, "this is something you're not going to ignore. The evidence you dismissed, there's a reason for that. And I've got it all here." Jamal's heart raced, the judge's face grew pale, and his hand gripped the gavel with white-knuckled tension. George opened the folder, revealing a series of reports, internal communications, emails, and even recorded conversations that tied Judge Granger to corrupt practices with local law enforcement and private interests. George continued, "These documents show that you've been complicit in a scheme to railroad innocent black men, using your position to silence any evidence that contradicts your predetermined judgments. You have used your authority to protect the guilty and punish the innocent." For a moment the courtroom was utterly still. Jamal's mind reeled with disbelief. Could this really be happening? Had the judge's arrogance finally caught up with him? The judge opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was shaking now, his facade cracking under the weight of George's revelations. Claire, her voice trembling but resolute, spoke up. "We have not just the documents, Judge Granger. We have witness testimonies, phone records, and more. You can't hide behind your gavel anymore." Jamal, who had been holding his breath, finally exhaled, his body feeling lighter with each passing second. It was as though the weight of the entire world had shifted in his favor. The room buzzed with the noise of realization spreading like wildfire. People were pulling out their phones, trying to record the moment. The once silent courtroom had erupted into chaos, but Jamal felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over him. No more trials. Judge Granger finally spoke, his voice weak. "This isn't possible. I've done nothing wrong." His voice trailed off, but even to himself he knew the truth. There was nowhere to hide anymore. Judge Granger sat frozen at the bench, his once commanding presence reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. His hands trembled as he glanced around the room, his face drained of all color. The documents George had revealed were irrefutable, and the weight of the truth was sinking in with a slow, suffocating inevitability. The whispers that had started as murmurs now grew louder, and the air in the room seemed to thicken with every passing second. George Thompson, standing at the front, didn't flinch. His calm, composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos that had erupted around him. His eyes never wavered from the judge. "You can no longer pretend, Your Honor. The truth is out." The other figures who had entered with George, Local journalists and activists began speaking with the crowd. Some took notes, others made phone calls, but there was no denying the significance of this moment. Jamal, for the first time in the entire ordeal, felt like he could breathe again. The fight had turned in his favor, but it wasn't just about winning the case anymore. It was about standing up against the system that had kept people like him oppressed for so long. As the commotion around him continued, Jamal turned to Claire, his lawyer, who was still processing the shock of the revelation. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I thought I'd lost everything. I thought the system was against me for good." Claire, still in disbelief but clearly relieved, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've never been alone in this fight, Jamal. Sometimes it takes a push from the outside to expose the truth, but it was always there." Meanwhile, Judge Granger remained still, unable to speak. His silence spoke volumes. The room had shifted and he could feel it in his bones, the inevitability of his downfall. He had once used the law as a weapon, but now the truth had become his enemy. His power was slipping away, and in that moment, he knew he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The courthouse doors opened and a pair of officers entered, the weight of the situation clear on their faces. "Judge Granger," one of them said firmly, "you are under arrest for corruption, bribery, and misconduct in office." There was no fight, no resistance. Judge Granger simply stood up, his movements stiff and robotic, his face marked with the kind of resignation that comes when you know there is no escape. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, the room remained eerily quiet. Jamal, standing in the midst of it all, felt a rush of emotions flood over him. The fear, the uncertainty, the helplessness. It all seemed so far away now. As the judge was led away in cuffs, the crowd began to cheer. The sound of people applauding, some with tears in their eyes, filled the courtroom. For Jamal, it wasn't just the end of a trial. It was the beginning of something greater. It was proof that even in a system stacked against him, he had fought back. He had survived. Claire, still by his side, turned to him. "You did it. You kept fighting, even when it seemed impossible." Jamal nodded, his expression softening. "It's not just about me, Claire. This is bigger than that. This is for everyone who's been told they don't matter, for everyone who's been silenced." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the courthouse. Jamal stepped outside into the light, his shoulders straighter, his heart lighter. He was free, truly free. And as he looked toward the horizon, he knew that his story wasn't over yet. There were still battles to fight, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the winning side. Jamal's story wasn't just about one man's fight for justice. It was a reminder that the truth, no matter how hidden, always has a way of coming to light. The system can be corrupt, and the odds can seem insurmountable, but the power of accountability and persistence can turn the tide, no matter how many times society tries to silence voices or cover up the truth. Those who stand firm, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, can create change. It's easy to become disillusioned, to believe that the forces of injustice are too strong to challenge. But Jamal's journey shows us that the fight for what's right is never a lost cause. It's in the moments of quiet courage, the decision to not give up, that true strength is forged. In the end, it's not just about winning a case. It's about the courage to keep standing, even when the odds are stacked against you. Justice, like truth, is not always immediate, but in the right moment, with the right people, it will always find its way. If you found Jamal's story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps spread these important messages. And remember, if you've ever faced an uphill battle or fought for what's right, your story matters too. Share it with us in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.